this topic, let's talk about the monitoring objects in our databases. One of the ideas that has gained traction in DevOps application design is that we want to instrument and monitor the features themselves that we've built into the software, the different methods, the different screens in the GUI, the different interfaces that we've built. We want to understand how our users are actually interacting with our software. There's no short of items in many pieces of software that are rarely, if ever, used by clients. And often, as developers, we don't know that. As a result, if we spend time working on those features and functions, we're wasting development resources. We want to focus on those areas that are valuable and that are used by our people that use our software. Even if there's a little used feature that has to be present, knowledge about which features are used more often might help us focus on what makes the biggest impact when we make changes. Right? We may have to keep some features around, but if they're rarely used, we don't want to spend a lot of time on them. And the same thing is true in databases. Often our objects are only accessed by other code, primarily application code, but certainly that might not be true with ad hoc query tools. We might be accessing all sorts of tables, index views, materialized views, other items. And the database usage is affected by all this other code. So we want to understand what code is being executed in our database. Where are we accessing the various objects? If we don't instrument the database, then our application users may not help us understand what parts of the database are most often used, because a feature usage in an application might not correspond to the same amount of resource usage in the database. Right? I can query a table for 1 row or 1 billion rows, and understanding that is important. Now, one of the aspects of tracking application users that is really valuable is understanding if they're still being used. Databases collect data over time, and we may not realize that we have dead objects in our database or rarely used objects, which are similar to the dead code we find in applications. We often are worried about removing that code or changing it because we don't understand if it's still being used. In a database, we might be maintaining storage or maintaining the API for a table when it's no longer useful. And it still requires resources, though. We have to keep state, so all that extra data may take up space, it takes up power, it certainly takes up index usage. We want to understand what's being used and what isn't. We find ourselves unwilling to often enhance or change code or remove items from our database because we think we'll break functionality. But if we haven't instrumented the database, we don't know. Certainly this is a problem in many platforms, it's a problem in applications, but what makes me wonder a little bit, why don't the platforms themselves track all this usage natively? Far too many platforms in the database world and in the application world don't actually track which items are being used. Now, some data is gathered by different platforms, but it's often transient in nature. For example, in SQL Server, we have a DMV called sysdmexec query stats, and this captures the last time a stored procedure is executed, but only while it exists in the procedure cache. And this data is kind of pushed in and out of the cache constantly. It certainly doesn't survive reboots, and so we often don't understand when the last time a stored procedure is executed. We can store this data off periodically, and we should, to determine if we're actually still using those modules. If administrators are tracking the application usage by method or function, and they know all the database access points, then they may be able to determine how the database objects are being accessed or if they're not. But it's often difficult to prove a negative, and often we do need to make sure we're capturing this across long periods of time so that we can decide if those objects are being used or not. Very few applications and organizations bother to track database usage at this level, and I certainly wouldn't start here, but once you have monitoring in place, this is an area you can improve your DevOps process. Assume all objects in the database are being used, start to track that and verify it. Our databases grow larger and larger and larger, applications evolve, we add new functions, and people stop using old ones. And so we want to make sure that administrators are increasing their telemetry so they're aware of which objects are still being used. This will help us in the future because we can determine then which objects are safe to change, maybe which ones can be archived, and maybe which ones can be removed.